All right, listeners, buckle up because we're diving into a rivalry that goes back literally millennia, the conflict between Greece and Turkey. You guys sent in a ton of sources on this one, so we're ready to unearth some fascinating stuff. We're talking ancient empires, surprising twists, and modern-day disputes with, global implications.
And you know what's really captivating about this deep dive? It's not just some dusty history lesson. Understanding where this conflict comes from, like the root of it all, it's crucial for getting today's geopolitical landscape. We'll be looking at the historical echoes, the things that still resonate in both countries' cultures and politics today.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit. We're talking about a rivalry that goes way beyond just like a simple border dispute, right? I mean, the sources we got paint this picture of like intertwined destinies and cultural clashes, power struggles that have, shaped the entire region for centuries.
Absolutely. It's crucial to recognize that way before we had the modern nations of Greece and Turkey, that land, it was a melting pot of civilizations. We're talking ancient Greeks, different Anatolian cultures, and then, of course, the Byzantine Empire, which had a huge impact on both.
So it's not like two separate distinct entities, right? It's more like this complex tapestry of cultures and influences that have been overlapping and sometimes clashing for centuries.
Exactly. And that complexity, it's key to understanding this rivalry. For instance, the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, was mostly Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian, and it exerted a lot of influence over, well, what is now Turkey, leaving this lasting cultural legacy.
That's so interesting. It really challenges that simple us versus them idea that we often hear about this conflict. But I'm guessing this kind of like relative unity didn't last forever, right?
You're right. The Byzantine Empire eventually declined, and then in 1453, huge shift, the Ottoman Empire, a powerful Muslim force, conquered Constantinople, essentially ending the Byzantine era.
Wow, that must have been a major turning point. Not just a change in rulers, but like a whole new cultural and religious dynamic taking over. What happened to the Greeks under Ottoman rule? Was it straight up oppression or more of a complex coexistence?
It was multifaceted for sure. It lasted nearly 400 years. While the Ottomans had a system that allowed some autonomy for different religious communities, there were definitely tensions and inequalities. Greeks, being Orthodox Christians, faced restrictions, often had a lower social position.
Okay, so this is where we start to see the seeds of discontent being sown, and that longing for independence starts to, take root.
Precisely. Those centuries under Ottoman rule, it wasn't just passive submission. It was a breeding ground for a distinct cultural and national identity for the Greeks, ultimately paving the way for the Greek War of Independence.
And what a dramatic chapter that is. It's almost like a movie Greece.
Yeah.
After centuries under Ottoman rule, rising up and fighting for their freedom. What sparked that uprising? Was it a sudden burst of revolution or more gradual, buildup of discontent?
Well, it was a bunch of factors, really. By the 19th century, Enlightenment ideas and those nationalist movements sweeping across Europe, they had ignited this desire for self-determination among Greeks. They wanted to revive their ancient heritage and create a nation separate from the Ottomans. This desire, coupled with, the frustration over their second-class status, finally led to the 1821 revolution.
And they actually succeeded. Talk about David versus Goliath, a small nation throwing off the rule of a huge empire. But I imagine this victory came at a cost, and it didn't exactly smooth things over with the Ottomans, did it?
You're absolutely right. While the Greek War of Independence marks the birth of a nation, it also sowed the seeds for the antagonism we see today between Greece and Turkey. The war was brutal, lasting nearly a decade, leaving scars on both sides. Imagine the resentment, the distrust that lingered after years of fighting.
It really makes you wonder if those scars ever truly healed. And I'm sensing this is just the beginning, right? The sources show a whole series of conflicts after this, redrawing maps and just deepening the divide.
Yeah, sadly, the Greek War of Independence wasn't this clean break. It triggered a bunch of conflicts, each one adding another layer to the relationship between Greece and Turkey.
So not one single clash, but a series of escalations. And this is probably where those national identities really solidify that us versus them mentality getting even stronger. What were some of the key clashes that, shaped this period?
Well, a few decades later, 1897, they clashed again over the island of Crete, strategically important and mainly Greek. Then, in the early 20th century, the Balkan Wars, where Greece, allied with other Balkan states, fought against the weakening Ottoman Empire. This chipped away at Ottoman territory even more and just intensified those nationalist feelings.
So every conflict added fuel to the fire, making it even harder to find peace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And looking at the timeline, there's a big turning point coming up. the Greco-Turkish War of 1919-1922. What makes that particular war so pivotal?
That war, it was a defining moment, shaping the people and politics of both countries for generations. It's a story of ambition, devastation, and the long-lasting consequences of forced displacement.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean kind of heartbreaking and complex. This war wasn't just about territory. It was about national aspirations, historical claims, right?
Exactly. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. And Greece, fueled by this idea of a greater Greece, wanted to expand into Anatolia, an area that historically had a large Greek presence. They wanted to reclaim what they saw as their heritage.
So it's almost like a historical tug of war, with each side claiming the same land based on their version of the past. I'm guessing the Ottomans weren't thrilled about this Greek expansion.
You're right, they weren't. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 actually gave Greece control over a lot of Turkish land, including Smyrna, a city with a big Greek population. Turks saw this treaty as humiliating, imposed on them by foreign powers, and it ignited a wave of Turkish nationalism.
So instead of peace, the treaty sparked even more conflict. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing this is where Mustafa Kemal Ataturk comes in. His name seems synonymous with Turkish resistance and the birth of modern Turkey.
Absolutely. Ataturk, a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic leader, he became the symbol of Turkish defiance against this, foreign occupation. He rallied his people against the Treaty of Sèvres, calling it an unjust carve-up of Turkish land, and led a very successful campaign against the Greeks.
He was like the ultimate underdog, turning the tide against a seemingly stronger adversary. It's another David and Goliath story, except this time, David's a really smart military leader determined to protect his country. What was the turning point in this war? How did Ataturk manage to push back against the Greeks?
It all culminated in 1922 when the Turks recaptured Smyrna. And while it was a victory for Turkey, it was a tragedy for the city's Greek population. Smyrna, once this vibrant cosmopolitan hub, it descended into chaos and violence. Much of it was burned, and the Greek inhabitants either fled or faced persecution. It's still a very sensitive and painful chapter in their shared history.
It reminds you that even in victory, there can be so much suffering, so much lasting trauma. So the Greek dream of a greater Greece was crushed. What happened then? How did things settle down after such a devastating conflict?
The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923, redrew the maps once more, recognizing the borders of modern Turkey and basically canceling out the Treaty of Sèvres. But the most impactful and maybe the most controversial part of this treaty was the forced population exchange that happened afterward.
This must be that population exchange we keep seeing in the sources, millions of people uprooted, based solely on ethnicity. It's mind-blowing, this idea of trying to solve political disputes by just moving whole communities. What was the reasoning behind such a drastic measure?
The idea, as the leaders back then saw it, was to create more ethnically homogenous nations, thinking this would prevent future conflicts. But as good as that sounds, the reality was a lot more complex and a lot more tragic.
It sounds more like a recipe for heartbreak and resentment than a real solution. Imagine families ripped apart, lives uprooted, cultures severed. How many people were actually moved?
Over 1.2 million Orthodox Christians, most of them Greek, were forced out of Turkey and sent to Greece. And around 500,000 Muslims, mainly Turks, were forced from Greece to Turkey. It was this massive movement of people, an attempt to redraw the map of humanity in the name of peace.
That's just staggering. And even if they were trying to make ethnically homogenous nations, wouldn't this just create more resentment? These were people forced from their homes, stripped of their history, their connections.
That's a really important point. While the goal might have been to prevent future conflict, the population exchange probably caused new wounds and added to the existing grievances. This displacement, the human cost, it still shapes the collective memory and the national narratives of both countries.
It really shows that history isn't just about dates and treaties. It's about the lives of people caught in the middle of these huge events. This whole chapter, with the forced migrations, the shattered communities, it casts a long shadow over Greek-Turkish relations. But we've only just begun to explore this complex story, haven't we?
That's true. And the consequences of this period, especially the population exchange, they would continue to play out in the decades to come, particularly on the island of Cyprus, which became a focal point for all those Greek-Turkish tensions. But that's a chapter we'll dive into a bit later.
Okay, so we've seen this period of crazy conflict and upheaval, culminating in that forced population exchange that totally reshaped Greece and Turkey. It's hard to imagine a more dramatic chapter in their shared history, really. And now we're turning to Cyprus, an island known for its beauty, its ancient history, but also so deeply caught up in this rivalry. What makes Cyprus such a flashpoint, such a persistent problem in Greek-Turkish relations?
Cyprus, you see, with its location in the eastern Mediterranean and its mixed Greek and Turkish population, it's almost like a mini version of the larger conflict. The island's history is this tangled web of competing claims, cultural tensions, and outside powers getting involved.
It's almost as if Cyprus becomes the battleground for all these unresolved issues, a place where the echoes of past conflicts just keep coming back. And I'm guessing that population exchange we talked about, it plays a big part in the drama that unfolds on the island, right?
Absolutely. The forced displacement of Greeks and Turks in the 1920s, while meant to ease tensions, it kind of backfired and created new divisions, especially in Cyprus. The island, which had been under British rule since the late 1800s, saw a surge in nationalism among both Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots.
So instead of a fresh start, the population exchange just amplified the existing divisions and anxieties. It's like trying to put out a fire only to have it flare up somewhere else, but even bigger.
What were each community's goals on the island? Were they just looking for more autonomy within a unified Cyprus, or were they after something more drastic? The Greek Cypriots, driven by this idea of enosis unification with Greece, they wanted more control, more self-determination. They saw themselves as part of the Greek world, culturally and historically. Turkish Cypriots, though, they were wary of being sidelined in a Greek majority state. They wanted guarantees for their own safety and autonomy.
So you have these two communities, each with their own stories, their own identities, and their fears about the future. It sounds like a powder keg waiting to blow. And I'm guessing the British, as the colonial power, weren't exactly helping to calm things down.
British rule in Cyprus, well, it brought some stability, but it also made those divisions worse by playing one community against the other. As demands for self-determination grew louder, the British found themselves stuck in the middle, unable to please either side.
Classic colonial dilemma, right? Trying to hold on to power while pretending to be neutral in a situation that's anything but. And we know that this volatile mix eventually exploded, leading to that crucial event in 1974. Can you walk us through what happened that year?
So in 1974, a group of Greek Cypriot nationalists, with backing from the military junta ruling Greece at the time, they staged a coup. Their goal was to overthrow the Cypriot government and achieve enosis unification with Greece. This move, though, Turkey saw it as a direct threat, and they responded swiftly and decisively.
So instead of uniting with Greece, the coup pushed Cyprus further away from that goal. It's like a terrible miscalculation, a gamble that totally backfired. And Turkey's response, if I remember correctly, was a full-blown military invasion that must have shocked the world. What justification did they give for such a bold action?
Turkey claimed they had the right to intervene under the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee. This treaty gave Turkey, Greece, and the UK the right to step in if Cyprus's independence or security was threatened. Turkey argued that the coup put the Turkish Cypriot community at risk and that military action was necessary to restore order.
It's interesting how these historical agreements, meant to keep things stable, can be interpreted and used in such different ways. It all depends on perspective and, of course, what each country wants to achieve. What was the immediate impact of Turkey's intervention on the island?
Turkish troops quickly took control of the northern third of Cyprus, essentially dividing the island along ethnic lines. Thousands of Greek Cypriots fled south, and many Turkish Cypriots moved north. This created a de facto partition, a division that's still in place today.
It's such a tragic outcome. A once unified island torn apart by political turmoil and outside forces. And this division, I understand, has led to a very complex and contentious political situation. You have the Republic of Cyprus, recognized internationally as the legitimate government, and then the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which only Turkey recognizes. It's a recipe for misunderstandings and diplomatic headaches, right?
Absolutely. The Cyprus dispute, with its unresolved questions of sovereignty, security guarantees, and the rights of those displaced people, it's one of the most difficult conflicts in the world. It's a constant source of tension between Greece and Turkey, and all the attempts at negotiation, they haven't really achieved a lasting solution.
It's like the island itself has become a symbol of those deeper historical wounds that haven't healed.
Yeah.
And sadly, the division of Cyprus isn't the only problem in this relationship. Our sources also point to a bunch of maritime disputes, what they call the Aegean Sea disputes. Why has the Aegean Sea become such a flashpoint, such a source of friction between these two NATO allies?
The Aegean Sea, it's not just some pretty body of water. It's a strategic and economic lifeline for both Greece and Turkey. It's got all these vital shipping routes, potential energy resources, and it's a key area for military operations. Whoever controls the Aegean has huge advantages, economically and geopolitically.
So it's not just about who gets to enjoy the beaches and the islands. It's about control, resources, maritime traffic, regional influence. And this competition, as I understand it, it plays out in a lot of different disputes: territorial waters, airspace, the militarization of islands. Can you break down some of the key issues that are driving these agency disputes?
One of the most basic disagreements is about territorial waters. After World War I, most countries decided on a 12 nautical mile limit for their territorial waters. But Turkey, worried that Greece would gain too much control over the Aegean if they claimed the full 12 miles, they've stuck with the old 6 nautical mile limit.
So we have this fundamental disagreement about where one country's jurisdiction ends and the other's begins. It's like two neighbors arguing over a fence, but the stakes are way higher when you're talking about international waters and potential oil and gas. What are some of the real-world effects of this disagreement? Does it just lead to diplomatic arguments, or does it actually spill over into incidents at sea?
Sadly, this disagreement has led to some very tense encounters, even near misses, between the Greek and Turkish navies. Picture this: warships from both countries, maneuvering close to each other, testing each other, pushing the limits. It's a risky game, and there's always the chance for a miscalculation, for things to escalate.
It sounds like a constant game of chicken, each side daring the other to back down. And it's not just about the water, right? There are disputes over the airspace, too, which seems even more prone to misinterpretations and accidents.
You're right. The airspace over the Aegean is another big issue. Greece claims 10 nautical miles of airspace, which is the international standard, but Turkey only recognizes 6. This leads to tons of airspace violations, with Greek and Turkish fighter jets constantly intercepting each other, engaging in these mock dogfights.
I can only imagine those pilots locked in this high-stakes aerial dance with national pride and strategic calculations behind every move. It must be incredibly stressful. And as if all that wasn't enough, our sources also mention the militarization of islands in the Aegean as another source of friction. Can you explain what's going on there?
The status of certain islands in the Aegean, especially those close to the Turkish coast, it's been a problem for a long time. The Treaty of Lausanne, which settled the borders after the Greco-Turkish War, it put limits on how much military presence was allowed on these islands. But Greece, pointing to security concerns and Turkey's growing military, they argue that they need to keep a strong defense on those islands.
So Greece is basically saying we need to fortify these islands because we don't trust our neighbor, and Turkey sees that as a provocation, a violation of the treaty. It's the classic security dilemma, right? One side trying to protect itself makes the other side feel threatened, and it just spirals from there.
Exactly. The militarization of those islands, it's become a symbol of the deep mistrust between them. Each side accuses the other of breaking the treaty and making things worse, which obviously doesn't help when they're trying to find a peaceful solution.
It's like history keeps haunting these disputes. Every action, every decision is seen through the lens of past conflicts and unresolved issues. And if territorial waters, airspace, and militarized islands weren't enough, our sources also talk about another layer of complexity: the discovery of potential energy resources. Now, we're not just talking about fishing rights, we're talking about oil and gas, the kind of discoveries that can completely change the balance of power in the region and fuel even more competition.
You're absolutely right. The discovery of possible oil and gas deposits in the eastern Mediterranean, especially in waters claimed by both Greece and Turkey, it's added a whole new level of urgency and tension to the agency disputes. The stakes are suddenly much higher. Billions of dollars in potential revenue and energy security are up for grabs.
It's like throwing a match on a pile of dry tinder. Each side sees these resources as rightfully theirs, based on their interpretation of the maritime boundaries and historical claims. And this competition, I gather, has led to some pretty provocative actions in recent years. Can you tell us about some of the incidents that have really escalated tensions over energy exploration in the Aegean?
Lately, Turkey has been stepping up its exploration in disputed waters. They've been sending seismic survey vessels and drilling ships, escorted by warships, into areas claimed by Greece and Cyprus. Greece sees this as a direct challenge to their sovereignty, and it's triggered diplomatic protests, military maneuvers, and a war of words in the international arena.
It's like a high-stakes poker game, each side trying to show their strength and grab a bigger piece of the potential energy pie. And it's all happening against the backdrop of this historically tense relationship, where every move is scrutinized looking for ulterior motives and threats.
You summed it up perfectly. The energy disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, on top of the existing Aegean Sea disputes and all of the historical baggage between Greece and Turkey, it's a volatile mix. The potential for miscalculation and escalation is always there. It shows that even in the 21st century, geopolitics can be a brutal game where history, resources, and national pride often clash in unpredictable ways.
So yeah, that whole energy situation adds a whole other level of tension,
Yeah.
and it makes those accidental escalation scenarios even more worrying. What can be done to, like, lower that risk to make sure those small incidents don't blow up into something huge?
Well, one really important thing is better communication between the two militaries. Having clear rules for how they interact, doing some joint exercises, even setting up hotlines so they can quickly de-escalate a situation, those things could really help prevent misunderstandings and lower that risk of unintended escalation.
It's like putting those safety measures in place, building those channels for dialogue and de-escalation before things get out of control. And it's not just the militaries, right? We need to strengthen diplomatic channels too, so political leaders can actually talk to each other, even when things are tense.
Absolutely. Diplomacy is so important for preventing conflict. Regular high-level meetings, confidence-building measures, even just being willing to try mediation, even if it doesn't work right away, those things can help manage tensions and keep them from boiling over.
Like a pressure release valve, right? Letting off some steam before the whole thing explodes. And it's not just about governments and militaries. What about regular people? What can we do to help build a more stable and cooperative relationship between Greece and Turkey?
There's a lot individuals can do. Supporting organizations that promote dialogue and cultural exchange, that's a big one. Taking part in educational programs, learning about each other's cultures and perspectives, and challenging prejudice and stereotypes in our own communities, those are all really valuable things we can do.
So building those bridges of understanding, making those human connections that can go beyond the politics and the history. It's about having empathy and recognizing that, hey, we're all human. And it's about challenging those stories that keep the hostility and division alive.
Exactly. Because at the end of the day, real peace isn't just about treaties and agreements. It's about changing how people think and feel. It's about building a spirit of cooperation and working towards a future where dialogue and understanding are more important than conflict and mistrust.
That's so well said. It's a good reminder that peace isn't just something that happens, it's something we have to actively work for. And even when conflicts seem impossible to solve, there's always hope for a better future.
That's a great way to put it. I think that's a good place to wrap up our discussion.
I think so too. Wow, we've really gone deep on this one. We've looked at centuries of history, we've seen the roots of this really complex rivalry, and we've talked about the challenges and the possibilities for the future. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope everyone listening has a better understanding of this conflict and what we can do to move toward a more peaceful and cooperative relationship.
It's been great sharing these insights with you and with our listeners. And like always, I encourage everyone to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep trying to understand different perspectives. Knowledge is the key to a more peaceful world where we're all connected.
Couldn't agree more. All right, that wraps up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and until next time, stay curious and keep your minds and hearts open to the possibilities of a better future.